Hello, this is the old guy. Today we're gonna talk about the state of the industry of cameras, and specifically Sony today. I'm shooting this on a CVE10, and I'm gonna use this camera as my talking head setup for many years to come. This is the camera that made the 6000 series obsolete, keeping the mechanical shutter, adding a multi-interface shoe, and pumping up the software. The owners of these may feel the same way as I described. They just made a high-end version of the CVE10. But does this camera deserve its price tag? That's the question. The CVE10 is a great example of how Sony succeeds. What I think started Sony's success was this camera, the Sony a7 III. This camera got it all right at the time. Great autofocus, like this CVE10 got right now. Good video, although not in 10-bit. But at the time, 10-bit was not the industry standard. Some camera companies came out with 10-bit at the time, but they were lacking on other features, like the focus we see here. I'm an event photographer. At the time, I used mostly photos. But I did shoot a music video just for fun. The link is in the description. It was my first ever video experience, so bear with me. But I think the story was good. I could have been better at the transitions and at the color grading and etc. But my only experience was still photos. Since then I've made a few wedding videos and I think they came out pretty well. Even my first one, my top-down shots were not made with the Sony. I always use this little M100, as you see here. I use a kit lens to shoot the top-down shots with. And I'm gonna keep doing this for a long time in the future too, because this camera does well. But we're gonna talk about this Canon M100 in another episode of the state of the camera industry, when I address Canon. But right now it's Sony. And let's get back to the state of this industry regarding Sony. What Sony does well, the two cameras I just showed you, is great examples of. But lately Sony has trickled out some features on different cameras, like the EVF, and sort of divided cameras into categories. The last true hybrid camera that Sony made was this a7 IV, and this is what I use for my hybrid shots. And when it came out, it was pretty good as well. It came with all the features Sony had at the time, and they didn't hold back on this. But they didn't make firmware updates, because all the hardware is actually better than many of the new cameras coming out. All the same. And that's what I think Sony's Achilles heel is right now. Trickling down hardware components, but innovating in software. We gotta give them that. But they're only innovating in new cameras. No firmware updates for the old cameras. The Sony a7 IV, as I just showed you, kinda got most of the features from the new cameras. And there's not many of the features that I really miss from the newer cameras like the CVE1 or the a7R5. But I would have liked something like LUTs to be integrated in this one, because it makes it so much easier to see what you get afterwards. I can work around it and it's okay, but it would have been nice. Everything else is kinda not that big a deal for me in my workflow, but it might be for you. We had a lot of talk about the higher end cameras that should be upgraded from all the YouTubers. But I think that the consumer cameras are suffering under this too. The a7 IV not as much, because it's kind of a new camera. But the a7 III could have been updated with the video capabilities of the CVE10. And this would have been a killer camera for many years from the basic YouTuber or the hybrid event shooter like me. I get it, you can't put 10-bit in this camera, but you could have given it eye autofocus in video. And I think the YouTubers are not addressing the problem when they're only addressing the cameras like the a7S III and the A1. Firmware updates is the Achilles heel of the Sony system. And this is what could make brands like Canon take market share from Sony if they adapted third-party lenses. Let that sink in, together with the Sony cribble of the firmware updates. I know that Sony has to sell cameras, and that's okay. They like us to buy the new stuff. And for a certain extent, I would do that too. But even for me as an event shooter, I can't be upgrading all the time. And I don't have the resources either to get used to new cameras every few months. To be a good photographer and videographer, you need to know your stuff inwards and out. And that takes time and resources and hours. And that's where I think that Sony gets this wrong. Support your older cameras, especially the good selling ones that's still on the market, like the A7 III, the A7S III, and the A1. I'm not about to jump ship. I like Sony, and I don't want to change system because that's really expensive and really resource demanding to learn a new system again. I changed brands over the Corona lockdown because it made sense. I had old cameras I used for 10 years. The Canon D1 Mark III's. I made the change in 18 and I kinda shot my Canon still while having the Sony A7 III because I was not yet sufficiently equipped to only shoot the Sony. Only after a year having it, I took it full out into my wedding photography and sold out the Canons. The great thing Sony did was that the cameras could adapt EF glass and that way making my transition much easier. I had time to make the full transition. And I knew that the Corona time would be tough for my wedding shooting. And for a year I only had a handful of jobs because of Corona lockdown. But I got a pretty good price for my old Canon stuff actually. I bought them used and sold them for not much less than I gave. So I was lucky. But now I invested tens of thousands into the Sony system. And I'm not about to jump ship. But Sony, you need to support the cameras that people bought and you still are selling. It's okay to skip firmware updates on the cameras that you're not selling, but please keep the ones you're selling up to date. That's all. I would have liked the video capabilities from the CVE10 to the A7 III, the capabilities of the A7 IV to the 7S III and the A1, etc. For photo jobs, the A7 III is still perfect, but I would have liked to shoot video like this on it, carrying the CVE10 software. I had to buy this CVE10 to make studio work. And my only complaint with the A7 IV is the missing ability to load LUTs. But miles may vary. There could be other users out there needing other stuff. The only new things that come to the new cameras from Sony is the AI chip. Everything else is software upgrades and savings actually. They take out hardware from the new cameras to save money. Some of the old cameras are actually better hardware-wise, except from the AI chip, that is. There's no EVF on the last 4 releases. Only one card slot on the CVE1. The screen is worse or the same as the A7 IV. The card slot is worse than the A7 IV's. The housing is made of plastic. I get it, the inflation made everything more expensive. And for a year, it was so hard to find parts. This goes for all the tech industry. Today we're just talking cameras. We're gonna talk Macs in another episode. And the A7 III cost the same as it did in 2018 because of the inflation. I get it. But please make firmware updates for these cameras. And as a consumer, I would like to pay $200 or $500 more and get some of the features from the old cameras in the new cameras. The hardware features, that is. Because then you would sell them to me anyways. Even while firmware updating my older ones. I would rather pay $2,500 like the A7 IV for the CVE1 and get some better hardware that lives up to the A7 IV. And maybe a fan and 2 card slots. Then I would buy 2 CVE1s for my business. My advice for all you consumers, as a budget guy that don't want to sell you anything, is to hold on to your current cameras and stop buying new. The newer cameras that you can buy on the used market are actually better hardware-wise than the new ones coming out. They just miss the firmware. But if you can find a camera on the used market with the firmware you need, I would go that route. Especially if you're a Sony shooter. Because right now, they're trying to fool you. Trying to sell you software updated cameras with worse hardware. Trying to convince you that you're upgrading when you're not. They're just selling you cheaper bodies with better firmware. That's it. This guy, I'm not going to sell you anything. I'm not gonna put up affiliate links on this side. I'm not gonna sell you LUTs. I might give you LUTs in the future. This rumored FX10 might change my mind. But until then, and I'm not gonna convince you to buy new stuff if the new stuff is not really better. At the moment, keep on to your old stuff or buy used gear, buy from the old guy.